Hi guys, this is A2 Economics past papers and we're doing paper 4 today. We're doing November 2018, which I think is a very good paper to solve. It has a lot of questions which are really important. So let's start with the exam. I'm not going to do the direct response, but I'm going to focus on essay questions. So the first question that I want to discuss is basically 2, which says discuss whether economic efficiency is always achievable in market economy. Now, this is a very good question because first thing first is that it will help us revise economic efficiency, and second, it will also talk about how economic efficiency is not achieved in a market economy where market forces of demand supply are basically allocating resources and how market failure occurs. So this is a question where we talk about economic efficiency, which is this part, economic efficiency, which is this part, and then there is basically the idea of what we call market failure. So I've written the sort of text, so I'm just going to go and look at it. The first thing we talk about when we talk about efficiency is that we talk about productive and allocative efficiency. We say this, that productive and allocative efficiency actually is equal to your Pareto efficiency, which says this, that if the economy has achieved both productive and allocative efficiency, it is Pareto efficient economy. When we look at productive efficiency, there is a macro approach to it, which means that if an economy is on the PPC, it is productively efficient, where all resources are, let me write this, all resources are fully and efficiently employed. So we say this, that if an economy is on the PPC, then that's where all resources are fully and efficiently employed. So that's the first condition for an economy on a macro sense to be productively efficient. On a micro sense, we are productively efficient, one, when the firm is productively efficient, or all firms in the industry are productively efficient. This happens when the equi-marginal principle is holding true, which says this, that, let me write this, equi-marginal principle holds true, which basically allows us to be making sure that the marginal product per dollar spent is same for all factors of production. And if we are making sure the equi-marginal principle is true, then we will be on the LRAC curve. So we say all points on the LRAC curve are productively efficient, but the one that a firm needs to strive for is the one which is the lowest point of the LRAC, which is considered as a point which has the lowest possible cost per unit. When it comes to industry, the marginal cost must be same for all firms. So the condition that is necessary for firms, all the firms in the industry, to be efficient is that the marginal cost of all firms should be equal. And if this marginal cost is not equal, we say that we could allocate resources from one firm to another to make sure we could improve the allocation of resources. For example, let's say if firm A has a marginal cost of $10, while firm B has a marginal cost, let me write, firm B has a marginal cost of, let's say, $7. So which one is more efficient? And the answer is the one which has the lowest cost, which is firm B. So let's say if I ask firm B to produce more and firm A to produce less, then let's say one single unit substituted would mean you will spend $7 because you're asking firm B to spend, but your firm A ends up basically spending, you don't spend those $10 because firm is not making it, and ultimately you end up saving $3, which would mean just by simple reallocation we are able to save resources. So just to quickly recap, productive efficiency from a macro approach means that we are on the PPC. From a firm or micro approach in a firm sense is that all points on the LRAC are productively efficient, which means equi-marginal principle is true, but the one that we go for is the one that is the lowest point of the LRAC curve. And from the industry perspective, we're looking at that the marginal cost of all firms must be equal. This brings us to the next point, which is basically allocative efficiency. When we look at allocative efficiency, the condition for allocative efficiency is that P must be equal to MC. Why? Because when you look at P is the opportunity cost of consumption, and when you look at MC, that's the opportunity cost of production. So the opportunity cost of consumption, if that equals opportunity cost of production, we say this, that this is where neither under allocation of resources is happening nor over allocation of resources is happening. And that is because consumers and producers are both producing and consuming at a point where their opportunity cost is the same, where demand or price is your opportunity cost of consumption and supply is your marginal cost, which is opportunity cost of production. So when demand and supply is equal and there is no market failure, we say this, that we are producing at point Q naught. Now if I produce before Q naught, let's say I produce here, like a point here, then the problem with this point where quantity will be Q1 is this, that consumers are willing to pay more because price is more than the marginal cost, the cost of making that unit. And by stopping here, I'm causing a deadweight loss equal to this area ABC. So this will be deadweight loss because I'm underproducing. At Q naught, the advantage of being at Q naught is that both the consumer surplus, which is this area, let me share that region, is this area, plus your producer surplus, which is this area, both the consumer surplus and producer surplus is maximum, which means we are neither overproducing nor underproducing. So in this question, the first part of your question, the first 12 marks basically will be dedicated towards us explaining the productive and allocative efficiency. Then we talk about, well, in market economy there could be a possibility of a market failure. So in a market economy, the market failure can result from a lot of various sort of reasons, for a lot of various reasons. The first one is externalities. Externality, we say, is a third party cost or benefit for which the party is not affected. For example, it could be a negative externality or it could be a positive externality, and those externalities could be both in the production or consumption side. When it's a negative externality, we say that there is a overproduction or overconsumption of the good. Overproduction could be because of production externality, overconsumption could be because of consumption externality. On the other hand, when there is a positive externality, we say there is an underproduction happening. So I have two diagrams here. I'm going to make two cases of market failure. First market failure would be, let's say, production externality. So let's say if the production of a good causes an externality, let's say the producer is dumping waste in the river, then the marginal cost, supply is right now S0, but supply should be S1 dash because the producer should be not producing S0 but S dash because he is polluting the river, which means the quantity should be ideally Q1. Like if I ask this producer to dump his waste in a responsible manner, his cost of production may go up and the supply curve may shift to the right to S dash. This S dash is what we call a supply curve that is basically taking into account the externality that is happening. Now at Q1 there is no what we call market failure, but at Q0 there is a market failure that is equal to this much. This vertical distance is your market failure or externality that is happening at Q0, but at C there is no externality happening, which means all this is area ABC is what we call negative, is what we call a deadweight loss. So area ABC is our deadweight loss that happens because of what we call over provision of the good, as the producer should be producing less than what he is producing right now. Similarly, it could be a case of a positive externality. For example, education or healthcare should have a demand like this much than the one that is at D0, because of the fact that it not only benefits the individual but it also benefits the society in terms of higher productivity, better decision making, long life, and so on and so forth. So the demand should be at Q1, where the new demand curve should be D dash, but the consumer will only consume Q0, which would mean at Q0 there is what we call AB of positive externality that has not been internalized, and that's why ABC becomes what we call our market failure, because of the fact that there is a deadweight loss that will happen. Now this area ABC now will be what we call a deadweight loss. So there is the first market failure, which is externality. Now I'm going a little fast here because I'm assuming that if you really want to sort of understand the content, you will watch the videos. This is just to quickly look at the answers that will be written. Then we move on to public goods. Public goods are what we call non-rival and non-excludable. Non-rival means consumption by one person will not leave less for another. Non-excludable means it is not possible for us to exclude the payers and non-payers. So because of the non-rival and non-excludable nature of public goods, it results in what we call no provision in the market. The non-excludability, as I wrote here, leads to what we call a free rider problem, where people are unwilling to pay for the good, and therefore there is no demand for these goods, and therefore while the goods are needed for the society, they may not be provided by the private sector because it's not profitable to do so. A good example of this is national defense or street light, which are then provided by the government because there's a market failure. Another market failure is what we call information failure. The information failure happens because people may not have enough information about the production or consumption of goods. They may not be able to make the right decisions. Producer may not know what consumers are willing to pay, and consumers may not want to reveal that. And similarly, consumers may not know the right quality or the right benefit of a good, and they may under consume or sometimes over consume a good in the case of demerit goods. So merit goods have positive externality and information failure. And information failure is basically the benefit may happen later and the cost is incurred right now. You may need to pay for education today to have higher income and other benefits that can happen to you. So all of this would mean that they could be under provision or over provision because people may not have the right sort of information. The next market failure we want to discuss is basically imperfect information, the fact that imperfect competition, the fact that monopoly can come about in a market economy, and that can result in what we call under provision because of the fact that monopoly charges where MC equals to MR, where we just saw P equals to MC is the allocation of efficiency, and monopoly having a demand curve which is such where price is greater than MR, they could be what we call a market failure. Now I have shown this diagram here that monopoly's demand curve is downward sloping and MR is below the demand curve. MC is equal to MR happens here, and monopoly charges a price which comes from the demand curve, which is PM, and the quantity is QM. If this same market was under perfect competition, price will be lower, PC, and quantity will be QC, because perfect competition produces at point C where P equals to MC. Now having said that, we're looking at this kind of a market failure that happens because perfect competition is charging a lower price and producing a higher quantity. So under perfect competition, P equals to MC leads to a higher quantity and lower price, and therefore no deadweight losses. So that's the problem that happens in a monopoly, which is basically causing the market failure to happen.
So these are the market failures that we will mention in our answer, and the conclusion that we'll write will be where we talk about how in a market economy, if there's no market failure, it can lead to what we call optimal allocation of resources, where both allocative and productive efficiency can be achieved. But if there is a market failure, there could be what we call inefficient allocation of resources, where there could be under or over provision or no provision of some goods that can lead to what we call deadweight losses. Moving on to our next question, the question number 3, which says this: analyze the factors which determine the price of a firm's product and its output in a monopolistic competition. So when you look at monopolistic competition, we're looking at some of the features. Number 1, the large number of firms in a monopolistic competition, but every producer is selling a differentiated product, so there is some kind of brand loyalty. There is no barrier to entry, which means freedom of entry and exit, and that's also a reason why there are a large number of firms. And because of no barriers to entry and exit, there will be each firm having a very small market share. Each firm is also independent and not interdependent. So one more distinction that happens between oligopoly versus monopolistic competition is this: that in oligopoly, firms could be interdependent, but in a monopolistic competition, because there are a large number of firms, each firm is independent, which means it does not rely on the other firm in terms of making its output and price decision. Now, due to the fact that there is differentiated product, demand curve is downward sloping. So we will make a very elastic demand curve for monopolistic competition, and the reason is simply because demand curve is downward sloping but very elastic, because although there is a brand loyalty, but that brand loyalty is very weak. So we wrote here that it is elastic as the brand loyalty is weak, leading to a very elastic demand curve. Now, when I'm making my demand curve, because it's downward sloping, my MR will be below. My MR will be below like this, but then we make our ATC, and our ATC will be something like this. And as a result of this, when I do MC equals to MR, which is basically where the profit maximization happen, so we write MC is equal to MR is where profit maximization happen, and we extend the line forward or upward. My price is like P star, my ATC is here, and I do have a case of supernormal profit. So firms under monopolistic competition do make supernormal profit. We'll show this diagram and explain the idea that there is supernormal profit. But the size of the profit will depend upon, number one, price elasticity demand. So if the good is inelastic or more inelastic, you will see that demand curve might look like more steep, and that's why the profit will be higher. Similarly, if there's a larger market share, demand curve may extend to the right, causing supernormal profit. So not only elasticity will determine the profit, but also market share will determine the profit, which will ultimately determine the position of the demand curve, whether inelastic or elastic. Now, in the long run, we can mention this as well. Since there are no barriers to entry, new firms will come, and when new firms come, it automatically leads to what we call lower profits. And lower profits is because of the fact that each firm will have now a lower demand, because the market share will fall, and this fall in demand will lead to every firm in the end to make normal profit. So the comparison between perfect competition and monopolistic competition is this, that monopolistic competition make normal profit in the long run, but they make a supernormal profit in the short run. Moving on to the next question, the B part says this: assess the effects on output and price of if a monopoly maximizes its sales revenue rather than its profits. So when you look at monopoly's decision to move from profit maximization to sales revenue maximization, we have a diagram like this. So I'm going to make a demand curve that is downward sloping. MR, just make a demand curve downward sloping, MR like this, MC equals to MR is here, Q star versus, let's call it P star, and then I'll make my, let's say, ATC like this. Now, if this firm was maximizing profits, they will produce at point A where MC equals to our MR. So at A, MC equals MR. But if you want to maximize revenue, then you will produce at point B, which is where MR equals 0. So at point B, your price will go down from P star to P1, your quantity will go up from Q star to Q1, and that is the point where you realize that the total revenue is maximum. Okay, so when you move from MC equals to MR to MR equals to 0, your profit will go down, your price will go up, price will go down, and the quantity produced will go up. Now the question is asking us the effect on output and price if a monopoly maximizes its revenue rather than profits, and consider who will benefit from this change. So if you look at the parties that will benefit, so first is that you will mention the price will fall, quantity will go up, and profits will decline. So if you look at the parties that are getting affected is, one is consumer. Consumers will benefit in terms of lower price. Producers will suffer, or shareholders will suffer in terms of lower profits. When it comes to employees, it will all depend on what we call incentive structure. If employees are going to benefit, they will benefit because their salaries are linked with the revenue rather than profits. On the other hand, when you look at government, the government will benefit in terms of the fact that our pricing is close to P equals to MC. So if you go back to this diagram, if you look closer, P equals to MC is this point, C. So at least we are closer to P equals to MC, which is point C, which is where the government will be at least happy that the price is not as high as the one where the profits are maximization. Then we could talk about some idea about this separation of ownership and control. So for example, when the shareholders are owning the company, but the company is being managed by the managers, there could be a problem of the separation of ownership and control. The possibility of managers of the business being different from owners lead to what we call the principal agent problem, where the principal being the shareholder and the agent being the representative of the their representative, which is basically managers, who may not have the same goals. That's the maximization of profits. And in that case, you can conclude by saying this, that the right incentive structures can align the goals of the profit of the managers as well as the shareholders. For example, if every manager is given the goal of maximizing profits, you may see the managers and owners' goals to align. Then comes number 4, which is consider whether wages are only determined by the market force, demand, supply. So this is a great question about what we call the labor market, which I feel everyone should be preparing really well. So when we look at labor market, we talk about the 4 cases of labor market, but the first thing is the market force, demand, supply, which is basically perfect competition. And in a perfect competition, we use Mrp theory. First, we'll explain what Mrp theory is. Mrp is equal to MP times Mr. We explain that MP is basically like this due to the law of diminishing return, and Mr in perfect competition is equal to this, P equals to Mr. So this MP times P is basically in the perfect competition, MP times P is your Mrp. So we explain the idea that the demand curve in a perfect competition is the Mrp, and talk about why it is the Mrp. Then we talk about in perfect competition, there are some assumptions. Number 1, everyone is a wage taker, labor is identical or homogeneous, there is perfect competition, mobility of labor, and everyone has perfect knowledge about the conditions of the job market, the wages, and so on. And in perfect competition, once we talk about the Mrp theory, we talk about this, that the profit maximization happens where MC equals Mrp. This is the point where we say this, that the extra revenue from hiring an extra worker, which is Mrp, is equal to extra cost of hiring the worker, which is the wage, and the profits are maximized. This is what we call profit maximizing level of output. Then we talk about the other cases. So the first case will give you at least 12 marks from the 25, where we talk about the assumptions, the profit maximization, the Mrp theory. Then comes monopsony. In a case of monopsony, MC is equal to Mrp again, but in this case, because the supply curve is upward sloping and my marginal cost is above my supply curve, because in order to hire an extra worker, we need to increase the wage rate for every worker employed. Your MC equals to Mrp now happens at this point A, which would mean the wages will come from the supply curve. So the wages goes down and the employment level also goes down. If the same market was under perfect competition, where demand equals supply, this point B would have been the employment level. But what happens is this, that the firms are maximizing profits, so they employ at this point A, and therefore there is a lower wage rate and employment level in monopsony, which is what we call a single employer in the labor market. So we need to remember this is a single employer in the labor market and therefore has a tremendous market power, which is shown through lower wages and lower employment level to maximize profits. Then comes what we call a bilateral monopoly, where a monopsony is up against trade union, and as we say that ultimate equilibrium depends on the bargaining power. So ultimate equilibrium depends on the bargaining power. Whoever is more powerful will determine the wages. Ultimately, it could be close to perfect competition, it could be close to monopsony's level, or it could be more higher than perfect competition depending on trade union's power. And both parties are monopoly in the labor market, and that's why it's called a bilateral monopoly. And the equilibrium I want to show you depends on the bargaining power. So first we'll make a dotted supply curve, we'll make a dotted marginal cost curve, and we make a solid MRP curve, which is the demand curve. Now MC equals to MRP happens at QM and the wage is WM. If the same market was under perfect competition, they would have employed WC and the quantity would have been QC. Now let's say bilateral monopoly case, the trade union says pay us perfect competitive wage rate. If they do so, this wage rate becomes the wage rate, and this is my new supply curve. In other words, trade union will say give us wage WC or more, but not anything less. So if that becomes the case, they say give us WC or more but not less, then WC ASL becomes my new supply curve. So my new supply curve would be WC ASL, and then my new marginal cost would be WC BMC. I don't want to explain this because that's part of our labor market video, but when we do so, when they ask for a wage rate higher and they are successful, then not only the wage rate goes up, but the employment level also goes up. So in a case of a bilateral monopoly, if the trade union is successful and they seek for a wage rate which is close to the perfect competition wage rates and employment level both improve to the competitive level. But if there was only a trade union, that will be a case where if this is my demand and supply in the perfectly competitive labor market, with the wage rate being WC, there could be a big issue because the trade union will set a wage rate above equilibrium and will cause unemployment of Q2 minus Q1, of which QC minus Q1 people are those who will lose jobs in this situation. So this is QC minus Q1 people will lose jobs because they were previously being employed, but now they will not be in this case. Then comes your government situation. Government can come control in terms of minimum wages, which could be shown like this: demand and supply, wages above equilibrium, like W, let's call it G. As a result of this, again, we're looking at unemployment of Q2 minus Q1. Or it could be equal wages, and that is also a problem because in that case, you're trying to make one group of people to have a wage equal to another group, which means that group will have a diagram something similar. So if this is, let's say, black workers diagram, and if you're paying more to black workers than white workers, then the black workers will end up having unemployment because you're setting their wage above their equilibrium wage rate, and that could be, although a good move in order to restore some equity, but that will be not good because the market will result in unemployment to happen for the black workers. Then comes our next question, which is basically to do with, where is it? Next question is about robots are increasingly used in various areas of production. Explain the type of unemployment which arise as a result of the increased use of robots, and consider the contribution this may take unemployment in the economy. So in this kind of question, we're talking about what are the causes of unemployment, what kind of unemployment will happen if robots are used, and will the unemployment go up or down in the economy. So let's talk about this. I've done some pre-work. So unemployment are of two kinds, equilibrium versus disequilibrium. We talk about then equilibrium unemployment could be structural, seasonal and frictional, while disequilibrium unemployment has two suggested sort of causes. It could be real wage or classical unemployment or cyclical, which is a Keynesian view. We can make this diagram to show that the equilibrium unemployment happens at the equilibrium where demand and supply results in QE workers willing to work, but actually QT workers are looking for work, because this N curve is my labor force curve, all those people who are willing and able to work but unable to find work, some of them, but all ASL is all those workers willing and able to work and are working. So this gap C D is my equilibrium unemployment, and this gap is my disequilibrium unemployment if the wage goes above equilibrium. But then we talk about this, that increased use of robots is what we call structural unemployment, where the long-term decline in demand for labor will take place as some industries no longer require labor. Robots will replace labor as they are cheaper and more productive. This may lead to a rise in unemployment in the sector. However, if this use of robots will lead to cheaper prices, it may increase demand overall, which is good because more incomes will be generated and therefore more profitability will happen, and this increased prosperity can lead to a rise in AD and therefore can also create more jobs, if not in one sector but in other sectors. So ultimately, will it affect unemployment? And the answer is maybe, depending on whether this increased use of robots is causing overall economic prosperity to go up or not. But the short-term implication will be that there will be unemployment that will increase because some people will lose jobs. But when you have structural employment, training can result in people to find jobs again and therefore benefit from this kind of shift or structural changes. The B part is to discuss whether GDP is a good measure of welfare. That's an easy question. We talk about why GDP may not be a good measure of welfare, but before we talk about it, what measure do we use? We use real GDP per capita, real to take into account inflation, capital to take into account, population, and PPP adjusted, purchasing power parity adjusted, to look at cost of living. Now, once you mention that this is the measure that we use, then talk about why GDP is not a good measure of welfare. Well, we say it may not be a good measure of welfare because it does not capture all the output. For example, non-marketed items, these are the items that are not bought and sold in the market, like for example, voluntary services. Similarly, hidden or underground economy, where the transactions could be illegal or unreported, or it could be public sector, where the government is producing goods and services which are not valued according to market prices, but according to what we call cost, because it's not possible to do so. Then comes that once we talk about that it doesn't capture all the output, it also doesn't capture all the welfare. And the reason why it doesn't capture all the welfare is because production may not equal to consumption, because like sometimes we do produce, like for example exports, or we produce like for example investment, which can cause our AD to go up, but both these exports and investments are not consumption by us today, but by us probably tomorrow. For example, exports is foreigners' consumption and not our consumption, so our living standard may not go up. Similarly, investment is going to increase living standards not today but tomorrow. Similarly, externalities can result in what we call lower standard of living despite higher production because of pollution and so on. Third would be distribution of income. If income is distributed unevenly, then despite high output and economic growth, people will not benefit from it. Last is just that if there is high rise in GDP, we cannot necessarily say there will be a rise in standard of living, because economic growth is associated with higher crime rate because of distribution of income become unfair, health because of all the stress, and number of hours people work goes up because of the idea that
economic growth requires people to work more. And that's why probably what we need to have is what we call alternative measures of GDP like HDI and MEW. You can talk about HDI as a measure that looks into real GDP per capita, purchasing power parity adjusted, educational attainment, and the third would be your health standards through life expectancy. Then comes our next question, which is about a country with an open economy has increasing demand for its exports and a falling supply of labor. Explains the effect of these changes on the general price level and the output. So, in this case, we talk about how your two things that happen. First of all, there is an open economy, so AD is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. A rise in demand for exports to take place, which will make the AD curve to shift to the right. As I showed here, AD naught will go to AD1. A rise in labor shortage resulting in AS to fall, and ultimately you can see this, the price level will definitely go up. What will happen to output? Well, it will be uncertain depending on the magnitude of AD and AS. Both vector will cause the price level to rise, but output may change may be uncertain. So you talk about how in an open economy AD will rise, but there will be labor shortages causing the supply curve to shift backward, and discuss how output will rise or fall or may remain unchanged depending on the changes here. The B part talks about consider the effectiveness of using monetary policy in this situation. Now, monetary policy is a demand side policy. You talk about how monetary policy results in money supply to, for example, in this case, you will, if you want to AD to go down, if you're unhappy with demand pull inflation, then you will have what we call contractionary monetary policy, which will basically be increasing money supply to reduce interest rates so that consumption will fall, investment will fall, and AD will fall. Also, when the interest rate goes up, it results in hot money to flow in, which results in basically exchange rate to go up and X minus M to fall. So that's one kind of a policy. But are you doing anything about aggregate supply? And the answer is no. So in this case, basically, while monetary policy is good to manage AD, we may need to use supply side policies to manage aggregate supply, because there's a labor shortage that is happening, which means a lot of retraining, maybe migration, or maybe other incentives that has to be given to employers and to workers to get the labor shortages sorted. So can we use only monetary policy? And the answer is not in this situation, because if you use monetary policy only, then something like this will happen. The AD will fall, the AS will still stay where it is. So while AD will fall, there will be price level going down to some level, but the problem will be that the GDP will decline in this case. So talk about how that will be detrimental for the economy, because you are not making the aggregate supply curve go to the right. Then we talk about other issues when we look at using monetary policy only, because when you use only demand side policies, monetary policy can be not effective to be used in a fixed exchange rate regime where they're trying to manage something else. Probably fiscal policy will be useful if the country has a fixed exchange rate regime, or if interest rates are used to manage exchange rate. The second thing you can talk about is this, that monetary policy may also have some time lags, or demand side policies have sometimes time lags where it can result in its effectiveness to show after some time. Between monetary policy and fiscal policy, probably fiscal policy is less politically popular, because it will result in some firms to it will result in basically fiscal policy can affect the poor people more than the monetary policy. Lastly, you talk about how supply side policies probably is a good way to go forward, because it results in no conflict, as both the GDP will go up and the price level will go down. However, supply side policies are very expensive to undertake, and they are only effective in the long run. So that could be a good answer for your question like this. Now, last question is basically assess talk about the features of developing versus developed countries, like GDP per capita, urbanization, debt to GDP ratio,
your unemployment and underemployment, and so on. So talk about all the factors, health indicators, and so on between the rich and the poor countries. Then talk about assess the extent to which multinational companies. So this is a note from this is something which you can sort of look into the notes. We talk about how multinational companies can bring in more investment, more expertise. It could also be sort of setting up their businesses which can increase their exports, and that exports will result in AD to go up, and also sometimes that kind of investment that comes help us in fulfilling what we call the saving gap in an economy. So all the all the features that multinationals bring in. Talk about the positive part as well. They talk about the negative parts, how there could be exploitation of resources, there could be policy concessions, there could be issues with where the multinationals end up controlling and owning factors of production and exploiting the local government in terms of their power to control the economy. So that's the paper, and good luck with everything.